How's that for a slice of fried gold?
You think this is a fucking costume? This is a way of life.
I'll be back.
There's a flesh wound. I'm not gonna hurt you. I'm just gonna bash your brains.
Take your sticking paws off me, you damn dirty ape!
I'm sorry, Dave. I'm afraid I can't do that.
It's alive! It's alive! It's alive!
I guess everyone's entitled to one good scare, huh?
Well, hello, and welcome to Cinema Shock, a podcast dedicated to the history and evolution of cult and genre movies. I'm Gary Horne.
Hey, I'm Justin Bishop, and we're joined today by our best friend, Mr. Todd A. Davis.
Hey, guys.
Hey,
Thanks for having me.
I don't know why I felt like introducing you that way.
Our hetero life mate, Todd Davis.
Oh, thanks.
Oh, man, guys, strap it in. Strap it in? Is that the way that phrase goes?
I don't know what you were going for, honestly.
It's strap it on.
Strap it on,
strap
guys.
it on.
We're in for the long run on this one. We're talking about one of the biggest movies we've ever talked about. This is on up there with maybe Night of the Living Dead and Texas Chainsaw Massacre as one of the most iconic films that we've talked about on the show so far.
Oh, yeah.
For
So
part two.
we're pegging those ear holes today, baby.
That's right. Our series on Dan O'Bannon, which I have renamed, by the way, is no longer Hollywood's Secret Weapon because I felt like that was an inappropriate title. It never really sat well with me because here's the thing. He would be considered Hollywood's Secret Weapon if Hollywood, were properly using his talents, right? He was like the guy they brought in, but he's the guy that they kind of ignored. Dan O'Bannon was. He never really got his due, which is why we're trying to give him his due. So I've renamed the series The Unsung Legacy of Dan O'Bannon. I think that's a little more accurate, don't you?
Yeah, and it's a little more poetic. I like it.
Thanks, Todd.
Yeah, I like it too.
Thank you, Gary. I appreciate your approval. But
I
Todd's
wanted your
approval is more important.
Wow.
Let's be honest. Todd's approval has never been important here.
That is a bummer.
Todd, you're an important aspect of this show,
Aw.
whether you believe it or not.
That's sweet of you to say. Thank you.
Otherwise, it's just me and Gary being nerds the whole time. Talking, but we need someone to bounce off of, someone that's going to challenge our views sometime. Someone.
Okay, I'll be that guy.
All right, so let's get into it, guys. So last week we talked about Dark Star, John Carpenter's debut film, also Dan O'Bannon's debut film. So during the filming of that film, of Dark Star, before their partnership had been disbanded, as we discussed in detail last week, Dan O'Bannon and John Carpenter actually talked about making a similar sci-fi film, a story set within a spaceship where a crew discovers an alien threat, inspired just like kind of like Dark Star was by The Thing from Another World, a film that they both loved growing up. And it was, as Dan O'Bannon described this project, as they kind of discussed it, he said it was like the same story, but in a different light. It was a similar concept, but he wanted to make people scared instead of make people laugh. And O'Bannon actually worked on it. He wrote the first act of the screenplay. And the plan was that this time O'Bannon would be the director. Of course, none of this happened after they essentially, the band broke up. the Carpenter O'Bannon band broke up. And Carpenter actually said, hey, you just take this, But that half-finished screenplay kind of stuck. O'Bannon kind of held on to it, and it's one that he would later rework with a writer named Ron Shusett, and went through several iterations and had multiple titles along the way. But when it was finally completed and released in 1979, it would be known as simply Alien.
Some of you may have figured out we're not home yet. We're only halfway there. Mother's intercepted a transmission of unknown origin. You got us up to check it out.
Human.
Unknown.
Minute this movement.
What happened to Kane?
Something has attached itself to him. We have to get him to the infirmary right away. What the hell is that? Oh, we gotta get it off him.
It's got a wonderful defense mechanism. You don't dare kill it.
It's gotta be a way of killing it.
Still don't understand what you're dealing with, do you? Perfect organism.
Get out of the way!
There's no fun story that I could find, and maybe you did different, on why it suddenly was called Alien instead of Star Beast, which I know you're going to bring up. Just so as we get to that, people know. It just seems like he just saw Alien a bunch in his script from everything I could find.
That's exactly what it was.
Yeah,
they were looking at the script, and first of all, Star Beast is a dumb name. It sounds like a Roger Corman movie, which this almost was.
Yeah, I was just kind of,
but
some sort of offshoot of D&D or something.
Yeah, but yeah, basically O'Bannon they were going over their screenplay and just kept seeing the word alien. So they're like, hey, this is a noun and it's an adjective, let's just, and somehow no movie had ever been called just Alien. So that's where it came from. And so O'Bannon had never really been thrilled with that beach ball alien from Dark Star, even though, it was funny. It was a funny gag. That's why they put it in the film to begin with, because they saw somebody walking with a beach ball and the idea of that being the alien made them laugh. But the experience really left him with wanting to do an alien that looked real. So meanwhile, around the same time, Ronald Shusett, who was a fellow burgeoning screenwriter, he was working on a project of his own. He had optioned a Philip K. Dick short story called We Can Remember It For You Wholesale, a story that became the basis for a film that would eventually be released as Total Recall about a decade and a half later. So Shusett he had actually seen Dark Star. And I think Shusett was a student at UCLA. He wasn't at USC, but he was a film student at UCLA, I believe. But he had seen Dark Star and he had been impressed with it. So he contacted O'Bannon, hoping that the two of them could one day collaborate. And they started talking, and between the two projects, between O'Bannon's Alien, killer alien screenplay and the Total Recall screenplay, they eventually chose to work on O'Bannon's idea because they thought it would be cheaper and easier to produce.
Get that low hanging fruit while you can.
So at that point, O'Bannon had about 29 pages of screenplay written. And it was actually called Memory at the time, which I don't know why it was called Memory. I could not find any information on what that word had to do with the screenplay.
Maybe because it goes back to his father taking Polaroids in the woods of ETs.
Maybe. But those 29 pages contained what would eventually become the opening scenes of Alien. You had a crew of astronauts that were awakened from cryosleep to find out that their voyage had been interrupted because they'd received a signal from a nearby mysterious planetoid. So they investigate, and when they go down to the surface, their ship breaks down, and that was kind of the extent of it. He didn't really have a clear idea of who or what the actual alien threat was going to be at this point. But before he could really flesh this idea out any further, O'Bannon accepted the offer to go work on Alejandro Jodorowsky's Dune, which is a project that would take him to Paris for 6 months. We discussed that a little bit last week.
Yeah.
And as we discussed last week, that project eventually fell through, but it did introduce O'Bannon to several artists who would influence his later work, namely Chris Foss, Jean Girard, aka Mobius, and most notably probably as H.R. Giger.
Yeah, as tough a experience as that probably was for him, it probably made up for it on the back end just with all the networking.
Oh yeah, I mean he would work with several of these artists again over the course of his career. So H.R. Giger, a little bit of background on this guy if you're not aware.
He likes penises.
He does. He does not like snakes and does not like worms, though. Is terrified of them. He is. He talks about it in interviews. It's very weird because he's this scary looking dude. Looks like a fucking vampire. But he talks about like worms. Just he's got like a intense fear of them. I
remember I was watching one of the commentaries. John Hurt talks about seeing him. He's like he's very goth. It's like, just even at the time, like he's, this is more accepted now, but at the time it was really weird. He was like, he never knew anybody except for like one other person. And then he met Giger and his girlfriend that were always wearing as much black as possible at all times. Very
pale skin, kind of like almost like dark rings around his eyes. Like he's part of the Addams family or something. So H.R. Giger was born in Chur, Switzerland in 1940, and he used those early phobias of snakes and worms actually as inspiration for his artwork. So even when he was a young, like up-and-coming artist, he was using the idea of fear as an inspiration for art. And he moved to Zurich in 1962, and he went to school there. He studied architecture and industrial design. But by 1964, he was creating his first like artwork, his first paintings, sculptures, things like that. They were mostly ink drawings and oil paintings at the time. And that quickly led to a solo show. He had his first solo show in 1966. But a little while after that, he discovered the airbrush. And along with it, he kind of discovered his own unique freehand painting style, creating these dark, disturbing, and often highly sexualized biomechanical landscapes that he would become known for. Then after his longtime girlfriend, after she died by suicide in 1975, his work took an even darker turn. He had these grotesque monsters with skeletal bodies, giant phallic heads, and he often rendered them in monochromatic colors, lots of grays and blacks, very little, if any, color in any of Giger's work. Over the course of his career, Giger published more than 20 books of artwork. He created sculptures. He designed an entire bar. There's a place called the Giger Bar in Tokyo, and opened his own museum in the late 90s. This was fascinating. Go look at pictures of it. But he opened his own museum, I think about 1998. It was housed inside of a castle in the medieval city of Gruyere, Switzerland. So he bought an old medieval castle and turned it into the Giger Museum.
Of course he did.
Yeah. And probably his most famous book was published in 1977. It's called Necronomicon, and it was that book that served as the main inspiration for his eventual work on Alien.
You hear, the background of what influenced his art. I kind of wish he'd gotten more into, I know he did some work in the comics industry, but I really wish he'd gotten hooked up with a couple of other writers like,
yeah, he doesn't seem like the type to do that type of creative work, like storytelling work.
Yeah,
to me, he just seems like he wants to create images that invoke feelings.
Yeah,
in people.
Yeah, he's all about the atmosphere and that kind of thing.
Yeah, although it would have been really cool to see him work with like James O'Barr, Steve Niles. Some of those guys. That
I bet comics couldn't afford him either. Because
you're probably right.
He seems to know his worth, and
he also worked at very large scale because he's
wow.
airbrushing most of the time.
Oh, that's cool.
So the way Dan O'Bannon put it, he said his paintings had a profound effect on me. I'd never seen anything that was quite as horrible and at the same time as beautiful as his work, and so I ended up writing a script about a Giger monster.
Nice.
He was fascinated by Giger's work, and after meeting him, he found that the two of them, they shared a mutual appreciation for H.P. Lovecraft. Like O'Bannon, much like John Carpenter, grew up loving and idolizing H.P. Lovecraft. They both had this, and same with Giger, they both had this fascination with kind of fear of the unknown, which is a staple in Lovecraft's work.
Yeah, and I even read in some places from O'Bannon that they had the idea with I don't know why I can't talk, but like Cthulhu being a big source too, because they like the idea of this thing that's like trapped and like just waiting to be unleashed. And so the alien kind of got some inspiration from that just, not necessarily the look of Cthulhu, but just Cthulhu's story as he's submerged at the bottom of the sea and you never see him. But if he ever escapes, then that's like the dread of mankind. Yeah, you're fucked if he gets out.
Giger's designs for Dune are incredible. You can find a lot of them available online, or watch, like I mentioned last week, watch the film Jodorowsky's Dune. But his brilliant designs couldn't save that movie. Nobody wanted to fund it. So after Dune collapsed, O'Bannon was left homeless and broke and ended up having to couch surf to survive. And eventually he ended up on the couch of his old friend, Ronald Shusett, and the two decided to revive that memory script that he'd been working on a couple years earlier. And O'Bannon had been stuck on the script. Like we said, he had written about 29 pages, but he couldn't get past that. So he asked Shusett to take a look at it. And the two eventually, it became a collaboration. They reworked it a little bit and they retitled the project Star Beast, and then began to shop it around without much luck at all at first. And O'Bannon would eventually take this early version of the script to Roger Corman. Corman thought the script was good. He liked it, but he told O'Bannon, he's like, this is going to require a much bigger budget than I can give you. I'm Roger Corman. do you know how I work? So he suggested that O'Bannon shop it around to other bigger studios because he thought it really had potential. And he wanted to see if he's like, hey, if you can't get another studio to give you a big budget for it, come back to me. We'll see what we can do and see if we can work on the kind of budget that I would be able to give.
Although I am morbidly curious to see what a Roger Corman Alien would look like.
Oh, there are Alien ripoffs that are produced by Roger Corman. They're out there.
Nice.
So, Roger Corman really liked to let's say riff on popular movies.
Okay.
And Alien is no exception.
Nice.
So none of the studios that they shopped this around to, they couldn't really figure out how to do the special effects for the film. That was something they couldn't really get their heads around. So O'Bannon, he went back to a second script that he'd been working on. This one was about a parasite in space, another sci-fi script, but a parasite in space that would attach itself to a crew member of the spaceship, and which, if you've seen Alien, sounds pretty familiar. So he combined elements of these two scripts and reconceptualized the monster from this kind of bizarrely shaped arachnid, like spider-like monster, to a more human-shaped monster, because he's like, then we can get a guy in a rubber suit.
Makes sense.
Which you should have learned on, I guess, on Dark Star that wasn't necessarily the best direction to go in if you're just looking for a guy in a rubber suit. It can go wrong.
Yeah.
But then O'Bannon got sidetracked from this project once again. This time it was because he received a phone call from none other than George Lucas. So Lucas, just like Jodorowsky, had been impressed with O'Bannon's work on Dark Star, and he invited him to help out on a little sci-fi movie he was working on called Star Wars.
Have we seen Star Wars? Have you guys seen Star Wars?
I've heard of it.
Okay. All right.
I think we'll cover it at some point.
Okay.
Probably watch it, but it's a lesser known one.
So for the next 3 months, O'Bannon designed some of the animation on the movie, a sort of crude early form of computer generated special effects that included the display that like shows how the torpedoes are able to enter the Death Star, that scene on the screen. That was Dan O'Bannon. I mean, and this was playing on the kind of effects that, I think Gary talked about it a little bit last week that he had done on Dark Star that had been so innovative. And it was cool. I mean, he got to work on Star Wars. So when we say the unsung legacy of Dan O'Bannon, like so far, Alien hasn't even been made yet. And he's already worked with John Carpenter, Alejandro Jodorowsky, and George Lucas on Star Wars.
Nice.
The dude had his hands in a lot of huge projects. You'd think he would be a household name, but he's not. And part of it's because he's, he kind of got fucked over. And part of it's because he's kind of difficult to work with, as we will get into.
Yeah, that conversation he had with John Carpenter seemed like enough to get him put on a couple lists. Or taken off of lists.
Well, whereas John Carpenter, even though he can seem like a difficult person, he knows how to play the politics. And Dan O'Bannon had never had any interest in playing the politics of Hollywood. So this work on Star Wars, it paid the bills. He got a job for 3 months. It paid the bills, but it didn't exactly have like Hollywood knocking down his door to give him more work. So I'm going to take a little side note on this because I want to take a minute to retrace just where O'Bannon is at this time. So he'd made Dark Star. That was a film that he had hoped would launch his career, but like we discussed last week, it opened to little to no fanfare. It closed as quickly as it opened. And then he spent months in Paris working on Dune, only for that to fail as well. But then he notices how his old collaborator, John Carpenter, had started to become recognized as a hot up-and-coming director, even before Halloween. His follow-up to Dark Star, Assault on Precinct 13, had opened at the Cannes Film Festival and was a pretty decent hit. So it made John Carpenter kind of a director to watch. And O'Bannon would later say, he said, there's a quote from him, Carpenter would call me up and got a big boost over rubbing it in my face, and he threw me overboard, and he was doing just fine. It was sheer cruelty. So there's kind of a weird thing between them. There's a rivalry between them. And at this point, John Carpenter's winning, honestly, because he's at least had some success. And O'Bannon, by the way, did begrudgingly go to the Assault on Precinct 13 premiere because John Carpenter invited him, probably maybe to rub it in his face, or maybe this is all just O'Bannon projecting because this is from his point
I was about to say, it's possible that John Carpenter was being a douche, but it's also very possible that Dan O'Bannon just, like you said, is projecting. Like he seems to have a hate on for most people
Yes, he does. But he went to it and he hated Assault on Precinct 13. He just thought that John Carpenter he thought it was mean spirited. And he was like, he said John Carpenter just seemed to not like people in his movies because they were treated so cruelly in his movies.
Well, it's just so funny because of last week and this week. I mean, I feel like we find Dan O'Bannon doesn't seem to like people very much. So
it doesn't seem to like most people, for sure.
Yeah, it's just so interesting to me that these are like, I don't know, these are his things.
I think they're both kind of grumpy dudes. And
but at some point, it's not everybody else, it's you.
Yes, exactly. If there is a common denominator in all of the issues that you have with everyone, and that common denominator is you.
Yeah.
So at the same time all this is happening, he was suffering from an awful wrenching pain just below his navel. Because we discussed this a little bit last week during the filming of Dark Star. He was hospitalized and misdiagnosed with appendicitis, but even removing his appendix didn't help. And it wasn't correctly diagnosed as Crohn's disease until 1980. But he'd already spent years being tormented by the illness, which, if you know anything about Crohn's disease, it completely disrupts the normal process of digestion. It just leaves you in immense pain. So the simple act of eating terrified him, because just eating could bring on this incredible pain in his stomach, which, I mean, you can't blame him for kind of being grumpy all the time when you're in pain that much, because there is no cure for Crohn's disease either. You can do things to alleviate some of the symptoms, changing your diet, but there's no cure for it. You live with it for the rest of your life. So he couldn't eat without it like hurting. A simple trip to the bathroom for him could potentially mean hours of pain, not to mention the humiliation of it, the mental strain on you. And this whole thing, it made him very nervous about traveling or even being far away from a bathroom, which makes it very hard when you're a filmmaker who, needs to travel for work. And stress made his condition worse. So the pain in his stomach was always on his mind. Oof. But what he didn't realize is that it would eventually serve as the inspiration for one of the best ideas that Dan O'Bannon ever had for a movie. So
I think I can see where we're going with that.
Yeah, it's that scene in Dumb and Dumber.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
Another wonderful contribution by Dan O'Bannon to the world of cinema. He is actually the pseudonym of Peter Farrelly.
There you go.
So Shusett and O'Bannon they're toying with their script, pulling from Lovecraft, they're pulling from a lot of things. Like O'Bannon has been quoted as saying, "I don't steal from anyone, I steal from everyone." So he's pulling from Lovecraft, from It, The Terror from Beyond, which is a 1950s sci-fi movie that's pretty cool, and pulled very heavily from Mario Bava's Planet of the Vampires. Their script had a crew of kind of working class astronauts, all actually male in the original script, who are returning to Earth when they're sidetracked by a message from a remote planet. So they've got reports that there might be an alien life form on the planet, so they send a small team to investigate. And then it's there that they find an ancient-looking abandoned spacecraft, and inside the spacecraft, they find a room of egg-like shells with spidery-looking little creatures. One of them jumps out and attaches to the face of the astronaut. So they've already got all of this stuff in their script at this point. This is actually one of Shusett's major contributions to the script. He imagined a creature that operated like there's a type of a wasp that latches itself onto a spider and uses it as a host to plant an egg. It's wild. I watched footage of it on YouTube.
He describes like watching a documentary, like a nature documentary, and seeing it. He was saying there was like this grub that was hides under a piece of bark, and it's sitting there, and then the insect slowly walks over and is like walking over the bark, and he said you even see it stop, and it like backs up. All of a sudden this needle comes out, and it just shoves this needle all the way through the bark and into the grub below it and injects its eggs. And he said that was just like super freaky.
It's super freaky because eggs are inside of another creature now. And I even watched some like time lapse footage of this caterpillar that had the eggs implanted in it, and you just see these little larvae start to burst out of it. So that's just their weird life cycle. It's fucking terrifying. Bugs are gross.
Can we post that?
Yeah, I'll find it again. It's out there
because that's messed up, man.
So that's where Shusett gets the idea. Only of course the alien's life cycle is accelerated, but that allowed it to change shape after it enters the ship. It's sort of ingenious. I mean, the fact that it hadn't been done before is wild to think of now, but it's a really genius idea of a way to get an alien inside of a spaceship.
Yeah.
So Shusett gave him, he told him his idea of using this wasp as inspiration, and O'Bannon listened to it, mulled it over, and then that night he wakes up in the middle of the night. Remember, he's still sleeping on Shusett's couch. He walks over to Shusett's bedroom, knocks on the door, and proposes an idea. You know, he'd been thinking this over, and all of a sudden, Shusett's idea and another idea of his kind of clicked together. And this is an idea that would eventually be one of the most iconic scenes in movie history. So O'Bannon comes to Shusett and he says, the monster bursts out of his stomach. So he explained to Shusett that the alien not only lays its egg inside of the human, but it grows inside and emerges as a baby violently bursting out of its host. And that idea, of course, was very personal for O'Bannon because that's what his Crohn's disease felt like. And O'Bannon also very specifically wanted it to be a man that got infected. He specifically wanted to take the trope that John Carpenter had used, the idea of a woman as your victim, and break it. He said, quote, having the victim in a horror movie always be a woman was a cheap shot. I always imagined the director jerking off. Oh, I can't wait to see that woman get chopped to pieces. No, I want to see a man get it because I knew it would make the men uneasy. So he's aiming this movie towards men in the audience because that's who is typically watching like a horror movie, you know, at this time in the late 1970s. And he wanted them to feel freaked out by seeing a man get victimized on screen.
Yeah, it's weird. He talks a little bit about wanting to avoid like the final girl phenomena, but it is interesting. I mean, Ripley still kind of ends up in that way, but she's certainly more resourceful and stronger.
Yeah, I mean, but again, that wasn't his. This is early on in his script, and at this point, Ripley is not written as a woman.
That's true. Yeah.
Well, Ripley was never written as a woman. But in his original version of the script, he specifically had an all-male crew because of this very reason. He wanted to see the men be the ones running from the monster.
Wow.
So that chest burster scene, the iconic chest burster scene, that was the first major decision that O'Bannon made that helped to make the film what would become an iconic one. I mean, we'll discuss that scene in detail here in a bit, but it is one of the most famous movie scenes in history. So coming up with that idea, that's step one to like this movie being the iconic film that it is. The second decision that he made that would turn out to be incredibly important to the making of this film was to pick H.R. Giger to design the creature. And this is a pretty bold move. I mean, if you've seen Giger's paintings, the ones that we described earlier, you would understand. I mean, they're very obscene. They're very off-putting. They look like nothing like any movie monster that's ever been created. So in the middle of writing the script, O'Bannon calls Giger, explains to him, and Giger doesn't speak very good English, so he's like kind of overly articulating his words as he's speaking to Giger. He's telling him the general outline of the movie, and then he sent Giger a package that included a check for $1,000 and some sketches by Ron Cobb. That was, remember that one of his production designers on Dark Star, some sketches that Ron Cobb and O'Bannon had done, along with a list of stuff that he wanted designed. And although the final designs were fully Giger's. I mean, if you've seen Giger's work and then you see the designs on Alien, those are his. But it's very obvious when you start looking at what O'Bannon was doing on this film, even before there was a director attached, that he had a very real vision of what he wanted this movie to look like. Like when he's sending these notes to Giger, he's describing the temple where the ship held the alien egg as ancient, primitive, and cruel. He told Giger that he wanted to see the alien in 3 different forms, the first of which he described as a small octopoidal creature. And then the third version, the full-grown monster, he described in his note to Giger, he just says it as a, quote, profane abomination. That's the only description he gave to Giger. And Giger ran with it.
And nailed every single version.
Yeah, he did.
They are all terrifying.
They are. And the producers didn't quite get it. Even that $1,000, like the producers were supposed to send that. That was kind of their deal when they were trying to sign Giger on, was like, hey, we'll go ahead and send you $1,000 now to start doing some sketches. And the producers didn't want to do it because they didn't really believe in the idea of having Giger on it. So O'Bannon wrote that check out of his personal account. and sent him $1,000. The producers actually suggested the monster be an oversized, deformed baby. And O'Bannon told Giger, he's like, I told him, but then I was just like, here's the idea that they have, but just kind of do what you want with it. So he didn't really push it. Like, he's like, yeah, I'll forward that message on to Hans.
Right.
And then I've done my job. I've done my part. Then whatever he brings back is whatever he brings back.
With Giger, like the cool part is that like biomechanical stuff you're talking about. Like even if you look at with like the best example would be like the space jockey in the film is just like, it's like he's grafted into the seat or whatever. That's like totally a Giger thing. Where does the tech end and the biology begin on that? O'Bannon, like he had like specific ideas, but the craftiest part of this is like he did seem to be willing to work with everybody. For instance, they talk about the face hugger. He had described it, like you said, like kind of like an octopus like creature or something. And Giger sends over the art, and he tells the story that they actually had to go to LAX to pick up the art like from customs because they got it. And they were all like, what the fuck is this? And they had no idea what was going on with these paintings. They had to like personally go and say like, no, it's for a movie, and like explain everything to get it out of customs. He said, Giger had like one thing designed. But the biggest part of his design that he liked was the thing. He said it was like more flat, but it had these fingers instead of like tentacles, like what he had envisioned. But he thought the fingers just looked like the creepiest thing in the world. He said, all right, no matter
knuckles on them.
Yeah, he was like, no matter what happens from here, I'm going to use that. Like that has to make it in the movie. That is the creepiest thing. So it's not even till later when like Ridley Scott's on board that they finish up the design of it, because like Scott has ideas about like kind of the shape of what it would look like. But O'Bannon actually seems to negotiate it with the, he ends up taking a part of what Scott liked and then taking Giger's design. He goes in it and this is later on, in the making of the film, but he draws out himself. Like O'Bannon draws up the pictures in with Ron Cobb, like sitting in the room. Like he draws up the faces and takes Giger's painting and copies it in detail and draws up the face hugger all himself. This is all O'Bannon. And
remember, he's an artist by, that's his background.
Yeah. And so it's just crazy, just like how much work he put into it. So he draws this whole thing up and he brings it to Scott. And it's like, this look good. And he's like, yep, that's it. He even had Ron Cobb, just for the added thing to it, that he wanted it to be so detailed that the skeletal structure underneath, like when you see it from the bottom, that it would make sense. So he had Ron Cobb actually come in and like design like what the bones would look like.
Yeah, because remember, Ron Cobb is a illustrator who is he was very concerned with things being scientifically accurate.
Exactly. Yeah. So that was a really cool part, I thought.
Because I think Giger's original face hugger was like huge. It was really big, and it had this big long like tail that was like a spiral that would, so he would spring out of the egg and latch on, but it was like bigger than a dude's head. It was really large. So even though he has a singular vision, he worked, when they came back with notes on things to change, he would change them accordingly. It wasn't like he was like, no, this is like how I'm going to do it. And if you don't like it, you can stuff it. But I figured we owed it to him for as grumpy as we make him sound sometimes. He was like negotiating these things out and taking different ideas and putting them. I mean, even from the color of the thing, he talks about, when he got the design down, he took it to the sculptors and they made like a clay version of the face hugger, and they did a molding, but they hadn't colored it yet. He had always pictured it like green, like reptilian. And as he and Scott were like looking at it, there was something away. He said it was just like that weird flesh tone to it. And he said he was like talking to Scott and like, man, we should just leave it just like this. This is kind of weirder. Yeah. Like nothing's been done like this before.
Well, in terms of the face hugger, the thing that stuck out to me is when they go in to initially examine it and it's laid out on the table and they start lifting parts. And I mean, I've seen this movie before, but just this time watching it was just like, that looks fucking real.
That's because it's a bunch of oysters.
Oh, is it? Okay.
Yeah.
All right. Man. Wow. What a
they didn't have the
great.
technology for prosthetic that was that good didn't really exist at the time. So yeah, that's a bunch of like seafood and shit that's sitting in there. Yeah.
Oh man, that looks. I clearly didn't know, but that looks great.
I love how I know we're gonna get to it, but just with like you're talking about some of those special effects, just how loose they are with some of these ideas. Just even to hear him talk about Ash later on, Scott's just like he's like, we don't have the technology, or like what's it gonna take to make something look really futuristic and robotic? And it's just like, I don't know, let's just stuff it full of noodles and glass spheres.
Marbles.
And he's like, that just looks so advanced. I don't know what the fuck's going on.
All right. So with the designs in the works and Giger on board, O'Bannon and Shusett finish the script. They send it back to Roger Corman, and he offers them $750,000 for it this time, which O'Bannon thought was a pretty generous offer. I mean, that's a lot of money coming from Roger Corman. But Shusett thought that they could shop it around. See, Star Wars had just opened, and it was a big hit. Let's say, which meant
Some
the
would
studios
say it's successful.
It's a successful film. So that meant the studios were more keen to buy a sci-fi project. And the fact that Corman had jumped on to buy it so quickly made him think that, hey, other studios who might offer us more would probably do that too. And he was right.
Kids, you're now finding out that if it weren't for George Lucas, all of your favorite movies wouldn't exist.
Yeah, it's not untrue. But so Alan Ladd Jr., the executive at 20th Century Fox who had greenlit Star Wars, happened to be looking for another space epic. He had hired a trio of filmmakers to come up with a darker sci-fi movie, one that kind of married sci-fi with horror. And those filmmakers were named David Giler, Gordon Carroll, and Walter Hill, together known as Brandywine Productions. So of the three, Hills is probably the name that our listeners might recognize. Before this, he was known for writing hard-edged screenplays for movies like The Getaway and The Drowning Pool. He would later go on to direct stuff like The Warriors, 48 Hours, and Red Heat. Hill and Giler had sold themselves to Fox, had sold Brandywine Productions to Fox as like they were writers who could punch up a script and get rid of the filler. So that was kind of their thing. It's like, you hire us to produce this. We're going to take a screenplay that has a good hook maybe, but isn't quite ready to go into production, and we're going to fix it, and we're going to make it a viable box office success.
Nice. It's a good
so
gig.
One day a guy
good gig if you can get it.
Yeah, I mean, and because especially with Hill, he had the background. He had written several movies that had been successful. So one day a guy named Mark Haggard, who was an old USC friend of O'Bannon's, visited Hill in their office at Brandywine Productions and dropped off a copy of the Alien script, and he's like, you should read this, and you should, should consider directing this film. So Hill didn't know who O'Bannon and Shusett were, but he was looking for a sci-fi movie because that's what Fox wanted. So he took it home and read it, and he got about a quarter of a way into it, and he stopped reading to call Giler. He told Giler, he's like, this script is kind of terrible, but there's this really great scene about a third of the way in where an alien incubated inside of a person bursts out of his stomach. So he found that chest burster scene alone was enough. That was worth building on. That was worth working on the script because he's like, I had never seen anything like this before.
To his credit, I mean, that's like one of the most memorable movie scenes of all time, I think.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So O'Bannon and Shusett signed a deal with Brandywine, but there was a bit of tension. Let's go. I'm going to go ahead and say Hill and Giler are also another couple of grumpy dudes who were involved in the production of this movie. Hill he seems difficult as well. Very set in his ways.
Definitely in the commentary stuff and interviews I saw, O'Bannon does not like Hill. Like no, he thinks he's like a dickhead, pretty much.
I mean, he kind of comes across as one, to be honest. I like Hill as a filmmaker. I like some of his movies a lot, but so there was some tension because Hill and Giler, they started making changes to the script, which is again their job. But Shusett and O'Bannon were not happy with this. Shusett would later say in an interview, they weren't good at making it better, or in fact, at not making it even worse. But Hill and Geiler, they added some significant elements to the story, including the character of Ash. That character did not exist in O'Bannon's original version of the script. They went through 8 different drafts of the script, and a lot of those rewrites concentrated heavily on the Ash subplot, but also on making the dialogue more natural, which I think they did a superb job at personally.
Yeah, I was wondering, because there's a couple moments where I was like, is that scripted? That sounds so off the cuff.
That comes from, I think, Hill's script and also the direction of the film, because there's a lot of this like cool overlapping dialogue that's very like Robert Altman-esque, where people are talking. You have to kind of decide on who you're going to listen to. Robert Altman was very well known for doing that, and Steven Spielberg does it. He does it in Jaws a good bit, and in Close Encounters. But
yeah, some of the
just
people
makes it
said
feel
that
more natural, you know.
Very.
Some of the dialogue in the original, I think it was Hill that described it kind of as, well, somebody had described it as poetic, and in some interview Hill said no, it was pretentious and obscure. But I don't know. O'Bannon didn't like any of this. Like O'Bannon was unhappy with this. He talked about like how hard he worked to not give psychological profiles to all of these characters, and to he said, you know, you're tempted to give these things in good movies. You see this all the time. He said, except for one thing, it always bores the hell out of me, except in so much it has bearing on the situation at hand. Quote, I didn't want to stop and tell life stories of these characters because I didn't give a rat's ass. I cared about the monster that was going to kill them, so I didn't do any of that. And his dialogue was like, stuff shouldn't be there that wouldn't be just natural yes and no conversation. They're real people in a real situation with real history. It doesn't matter why they're there. Who gives a shit?
I'm not sure I agree with that, but
but O'Bannon, that's how O'Bannon is, and he hated Ash. Like, he thought that was stupid. He did not think much of a robot being there. He calls it the Russian spy treatment. He says it's like Fantastic Voyage. He says it's annoying. He says, why does there always have to be a Russian spy? He says it's a common tension device. He describes it as like, you know, in Fantastic Voyage, it's like you're getting to go do all of this awesome stuff, but then you find out there's a Russian spy. He says, quote, it's an inferior idea from inferior minds that in this movie is well acted and well directed. Fortunately, it does not take up too much time.
Well, Ron Shusett in later interviews would say that it was one of the better contributions to the script. He said he thought it was a genius idea adding the Ash character, and maybe that's just Shusett being much more neutrally or more playing politics a little bit more or a little bit better than O'Bannon does. But Shusett seems to really like the idea and thought it was an excellent idea to add the Ash character to the story.
Yeah, I just I had to make sure we cover. It just feels like so O'Bannon. That's a direct quote from the commentary. It's an inferior idea from inferior minds that's well acted and well directed. Fortunately, it doesn't take up too much time.
I kind of love how cranky he is, honestly. I love it. He's a fun guy to watch in interviews too, because he's like, if you see him in later interviews, like where he's older, he's got the white hair and the glasses, and he's always wearing like a bow tie and suspenders.
Right.
He's a character. So Walter Hill takes the idea to Alan Ladd, and he's like, this is B movie material, but if we dress it up with A movie production values, we could fool the audience into thinking it's an A movie. That was kind of his pitch to Alan Ladd. And Alan Ladd went for it, but with one caveat. He said, if we're going to do this, we're going to do it big. He wanted Alien to look like a blockbuster. He essentially wanted another Star Wars. And just like that, this little monster movie that was supposed to star a guy in a rubber suit became a $10 million event film for a major studio. And this was a huge deal for Dan O'Bannon, for his career as well as for his health, because 1977, when this is all going down, had been very tough for him health-wise. His Crohn's disease had sent him in and out of the hospital multiple times that year. And, you know, things are looking up finally for Dan. You know, with Alien, he was given screenwriting credit on the film, despite the fact that the shooting script was written by Hill and Geiler. But he also negotiated to where he had a say in the look of the film. And in doing that, he was able to bring in his old co-workers from Dune, illustrator Chris Foss, Mobius, and Ron Cobb.
Yeah, I love the addition of Ron Cobb. I mean, you know, we'll not forget that he's from Dark Star as well. But he had also done apparently uncredited work on Star Wars for like creature designs, like
really,
just interesting like creature concepts and stuff like that. So he was kind of blazing his own trail in the industry there, and he seems to be another guy that O'Bannon bounced ideas off of pretty regularly.
They seem to be big collaborators more than just like I'm going to hire you to design. Like they bounced ideas off each other a lot, it seemed.
Yeah, I mean, like for instance, like the acid blood, that's Ron Cobb.
That was Ron Cobb. Yep.
Yeah, he had just
genius idea.
Yeah, O'Bannon was like basically stuck at this point of why don't they just kill him? You know, why don't they just kill the alien? Like he didn't want, he thought it was too tropey to like include this like bulletproof monster. He thought that he wanted it to seem real, like biological, like this is a real thing. And so, yeah, you could shoot it up and it would die. But like, why wouldn't you do that? And besides the fact that these are space truckers, so they're just walking around with guns.
Aliens.
But yeah, that's what they do in Aliens. But he said he was talking to Ron Cobb about it. Ron Cobb just came up with the ideas like, what if you just had a acid for blood, and it would just like burn through the ship if it like melts metal. And hey, it's like O'Bannon's just like, yes, that's perfect.
It's a great idea.
Yeah.
So now you don't kill it.
So O'Bannon's vision for Alien was similar to what Jodorowsky wanted to do on Dune, which was you put a bunch of great artists in a room together and let them trade ideas and bounce things off each other, you know? And the plan was for Ron Cobb to design the spaceships using the latest cutting edge science. Remember, as we discussed in our Dark Star episode, Cobb was a designer who liked his sci-fi designs to seem functional. Only this time the budget would allow them to use more than, just egg cartons and ice cube trays in the design. But they still saw the aesthetic, much like in Dark Star, as dirty, industrial, rusted, that used space look that had never really been seen before. Giger's style, on the other hand, had no basis in science. He did not care at all if his alien looked like it could biologically exist. It didn't have eyes. Like, who cares? Giger wasn't worried about the science of it. He just wanted to create something that looked scary. He could give a shit if it's something that is based in science.
I even thought, I think I saw somewhere where he like even had eyes at first and then took them off. I was like, nah, it's going to be creepier if it sniffs you out.
Oh, yeah.
And his designs for the alien were based on his painting Necronom 4. If you ever Google that if you want, and you'll see an alien xenomorph. That's what's in that painting. He made several conceptual paintings of the creature before settling on the final version, and then he sculpted the creature himself. Although the creature's head was created by a guy named Carlo Rambaldi, who'd worked on the aliens on Steven Spielberg's Close Encounters of the Third Kind. Carlo Rambaldi is a kind of a legendary effects guy and would eventually win an Oscar for his work on this film. And he stuck pretty close to Giger's design, but he did make some modifications to the head that would allow him to turn it into this fully articulated head. It had, hinges for the mouth, cables, and, for allowing that inner mouth to extend, things like that. And then they covered the whole thing in slime, and that slime was actually just KY jelly.
Which is why it seems like your mom at some points. Like it just she's always just covered in KY. That was a joke. There was a joke there. There was your mama joke somewhere in there. I dropped the ball.
In space, no one can hear you spank it.
I was gonna go in space. No one can hear you cream.
Oh yeah, I see what you're going
that wins. Yeah.
Well done. And you're the writer comedian here.
I'll take the silver. I'll take the silver medal. That's fine.
Wait, why does that mean I got? Well, I kind of gave up on mine halfway through, so it's only fair. So okay, fine. But yeah, the cool part here is that the Giger style, it's fantastic, like just the way this thing looks. A lot of like Scott was saying, the interiors and stuff of those ships are all Ron Cobb. He actually gives credit to him for like most of that. And but then the Giger stuff is like anything alien is Giger, and like pretty much anything human is like Ron Cobb did a lot of that design work.
Yeah. And Chris Foss did a lot of his kind of whole thing was conceptual design of the exteriors of the spaceships. Ron Cobb did a lot of the interiors and figuring out the design of how the spaceship could actually function. Whereas Chris Foss, like he was a sci-fi illustrator. He did sci-fi novel covers, and so that was kind of his thing, was creating the stuff on the outside of the Nostromo.
Yeah, and my apologies. I'm like bouncing all back and forth with like jumping into the actual production of the film itself, but instead of just the designs where you're really talking about. But anyway, I just remember reading a bunch about this and just it was really cool. O'Bannon was here too, though. Like he had ideas, once they actually got into designing them, like Cobb had done all straight hallways. So like O'Bannon was thinking of the tension of the thing. It was talking about he made him go he suggested redesigning the hallways to have like corners. He's like, you want blind spots so you don't know what's around the turn. Like you got to have that stuff.
It's a great idea. So things are looking up for O'Bannon, but being O'Bannon, he is a pessimist at heart. He always kind of expected things to go wrong. He was worried that the studio would change his script or try to stop him from using Giger's designs. And those things kind of did happen. The studio started to get nervous. Hill and Giler are already changing the script, but the studio, they started to get unsure about this because as we'll talk about the casting in a bit, but even as it started to get cast, like none of the people who are in it are like big movie stars. Although if they had looked back at, Star Wars, nobody in that was a movie star either. The writers were unproven, and those Giger designs were not exactly family friendly. They were like, how are parents who took their kids to Star Wars going to feel about a monster with a head that looks like a big black dick?
Well, families today have Pornhub, so that's just common. They don't have to worry.
And there's lots of families on Pornhub, so there you
step
go.
families,
really. It's a lot of step families.
What are you doing, Step Todd?
But one of them's away on business a lot.
So the studio also had a director problem here. Walter Hill left the film once he realized that he's like, there's going to be a lot of special effects in this movie. And he was kind of always bored of the idea of doing special effects work. I don't know how he initially didn't think this was going to be an effects heavy movie when he read the script, but that was his reasoning for leaving. But there was probably another reason. One, that he never really had a lot of faith in the project. It didn't seem. He never really seemed to be that into it. Plus, he had another movie that he wanted to work on. He had another movie that it was kind of in development that he wanted to work on. So he left to go work on that project. That project would end up being Southern Comfort, which is a really good movie, but it's not Alien.
Yeah, I was going to say. All right.
Although maybe a Walter Hill version of Alien would not have been this movie at all, True. So Fox goes looking for other directors, and several of them turn the project down until eventually the job was accepted by a newcomer by the name of Ridley Scott. I'm sure you know that name. He's incredibly famous now, but at the time he was relatively new. Ridley Scott's an English director. He'd gotten his start in filmmaking by making television commercials, was very well known as a commercial director. And he had recently made his film debut with the 1977 film The Duelist, which won the award for Best Debut Film at the Cannes Film Festival.
Supposedly this guy Sanford Lieberson I had seen that movie, who worked for like 20th Century Fox London division, and he was the first person that started like passing script stuff over to Scott when the director stuff started to go up in the air, had been pushing it over to him.
Well, I mean, it's funny because there's nothing about The Duelist that makes you think this guy needs to do a sci-fi movie, because The Duelist is about it's about two duelists in like Napoleonic France. There's nothing fantastic about it at all. And it had not been like a big hit at the box office, but like we said, it had won some acclaim, some critical acclaim and some awards. And it had caught Hollywood's attention because of how it looks, because of this flashy aesthetic, because there's one thing about Ridley Scott. I'm hit or miss on Ridley Scott as a director. Like, I think he can be very, very good, but I think he can be bad as well. But there's one thing, good or bad, regardless of how I feel about the film, one of his films as a whole, is that they always look fantastic. And that's because, again, he got his start in commercials, and he had a background in that kind of stuff. He had to be able to tell stories in a visual sense in 30 seconds at a time. There are Ridley Scott movies, like, obviously this is a very high point, this movie, but something like Legend, I do not like Legend at all. I think Legend is very boring and not a good movie, but I think it looks gorgeous. And that's kind of that visual style is what caught Hollywood's attention. That's what made people think of him for even movies like this that didn't seem to be, in the wheelhouse of what he had made before. And Ridley Scott, he actually, after the success of Star Wars, he actually saw where the tide was turning, and he wanted to work on a space film next. So when Fox came to him and offered him Alien, he jumped on the opportunity.
Yeah, it's interesting. Like Ronald Shusett tells the story that like when Scott was approached, and now at this point, they'd supposedly been through potential directors. Scott says he was 5th on the list.
Any idea who the other ones were?
Yeah, some of the names I saw were Peter Yates, Jack Clayton, well, obviously Walter Hill. There was a point Dan O'Bannon was considered for the directing role, and Robert Aldrich, who did I just watched the other day Whatever Happened to Baby Jane, and he did that movie, and I thought it was fantastic. It was my first time seeing it, and I really, really loved that movie. But one thing that drove me nuts is I saw that he was actually the closest, supposedly, out of those names before Walter Hill, and they said that he lost the job because they came up to him talking about the design of the face hugger, and they said Aldrich just shrugged and said, I think we'll just put some entrails on the guy's face. It's not like anybody's going to remember that thing once they left the theater.
So, he clearly did not have a grasp on the screenplay at all.
Yeah. And so anyway, yeah, but Ridley Scott, according to Ronald Shusett, and this is interesting because there is a story, and I think you have it in your notes too to talk about later, but like of O'Bannon showing them Texas Chainsaw. But Shusett tells a story that says the first thing that Ridley Scott told him when they were talking to him about the job, because Shusett, he was co-writer, but he's also a producer on here. He said that Scott said, I want to make a straightforward, unpretentious, riveting thriller. I'm thinking Psycho, Rosemary's Baby, or even brilliant B-level stuff like Night of the Living Dead or Texas Chainsaw. He said, and he's like, but I want it to look, he said, quote, and I want it to look, and I'm going to do this. It's going to be those things, and it's going to look like 2001.
Yeah, and that's awesome. What a great approach.
Yeah. Great approach. And he said just the way he talked about it, he was like, I knew he could do it. And I didn't, he said he had seen like The Duelist and thought maybe this would be like a pretentious guy, but he said that he and O'Bannon and Scott throughout the making of the movie would sit and watch all kinds of scare movies because they wanted to learn, like it was important to get the timing down. And that's something we'll talk about a little bit later too. But, for all those who doubt Alien as a horror movie, I mean, that's 100% the thought process that.
Are there alien doubters? I
don't know. I just think, I don't know. Like when people think of like favorite horror movies, I don't know that like Alien for casual viewers would be like a first that would.
I don't know, man. Yeah. I mean, I think people get caught up in the fact that it's set in space and they're like, oh, it's a sci-fi. No, it's a horror. Like it can be fucking both, It can be a sci-fi and a horror movie. And it is both. And it's not the first or the last movie to be both a horror movie and a sci-fi movie. So that's like, you don't have to put it in one or the other. And
I could be just making that
movie.
Up.
It's a haunted house movie that happens to be set in space.
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
No, I didn't think about it like that. That's true.
Oh, that's 100% the way he'll pitch Harry Dean Stanton, but we'll talk about that later. But like the, I mean, O'Bannon and Shushit, they 100% were thinking of it with horror. So I think Scott sold him that he also was coming into this like, nah, man,
more as a horror movie than a sci-fi movie.
Yeah, and he's like, it's a B movie, a B horror movie, and we're gonna make it look like 2001.
Yeah,
and,
which is again how Hill initially sold it to Alan Ladd, and even though Hill is no longer a director, he's still a producer of this. Brandywine Productions is still producing, so Hill is actually still involved as well. So here we are. We've got Ridley Scott, we've got a script, we've got H.R. Giger. All these things are coming into place to create this movie, but now we've got to get a cast. We've got to get 7 human beings to live on the Nostromo. And that's a story for next week, guys.
Oh, All right.
We're going 2 episodes on Alien.
Oh,
how
first
could you
time we've
not?
ever done it.
It's one of the greatest movies ever made.
It
I
may
want to hear
or
your
may not be
bullshit,
the last
Todd.
time we ever do it.
I'm excited. I'm excited.
Yeah, we decided to go 2 episodes on this one just because there's a lot of story with Alien, and if we tried to cram all this into one episode, we would either A, not be doing the movie the service that it deserves, or B, doing like a 4-hour episode, and we're not going to do that to you. So we're going to release half of this now, and then
who do you think we are? Zack Snyder?
Speaking of which, go listen to our bonus episode. It's out now.
Yeah, if you've wondered where the contempt in Todd's voice comes from, you can look at our bonus episode on the Justice League, Zack Snyder's Justice League.
So next week we will be continuing our story of Dan O'Bannon and Ridley Scott's Alien for part 2 of this particular episode. I don't even know how to refer to this at this point. It's uncharted territory, boys.
Yep, we've never done a 2-parter, but here we are. So
everyone who listened to like 2.5 hours on Texas Chainsaw is like, maybe they should have thought of this idea earlier.
Yeah, probably.
We'll see if we do this in the future. But this one, as me and Gary were writing up notes, we're just like, this is a lot of fucking notes, dude. Like, this is a lot of information. And I know that there's stuff that we're not even going to hit.
As we're recording this, it's on Easter Sunday, and my wife is trying to get me to go to this Easter lunch, and I'm like, I have 24 pages of notes in front of me right now. That's like mine and Justin's combined.
Did you skip out on Easter lunch?
No, I ended up going, and I just came back, and I was like, I got everything in position. Well, this is inside baseball for everyone, but Justin usually sends me his notes that I use as a framework for my notes to like when it's okay to talk about certain things. And it's just, I don't know. It was a lot of stuff. It's so overwhelming.
It was a lot of stuff.
There's so much alien knowledge out there, and
the movie
still will not
almost
cover
50
all
years
of it.
old. So it's a lot. Anyway, we'll be back next week to continue discussing Alien. And until then, I guess let's tell people where you guys can be found on the internet.
This is Gary Horne.
I'm at Mr. Todd A. Davis.
I am at Justin_Bishop. You can find the show at cinema_shock. That's Twitter, Instagram. Like us on Facebook, subscribe, rate, review on all your favorite podcasting apps. You can also listen to Gary on This Is Pro Wrestling or on the official NWA YouTube channel on Tuesday nights.
Yeah.
And you can listen to Todd on Computer Resume, his Star Trek podcast, available.
Leave it to Justin.
Actually,
we can't promote our old shit, but thank you, Justin.
I got to do it for you. I'm your hype man here. And Todd's podcast is now available on most of the major podcasting platforms. It's on Apple now, which is
yay!
That's a big
significant move forward, Todd.
Yes.
Congratulations.
We're taking steps. We're taking baby steps, but we are taking steps.
Well, until next week, fellas.
May the wings of liberty never lose a feather.
Be excellent to each other.
In space, nobody has the keys.
That's good.
I did like that one.
That's good. Right. I almost said, "Here's to swimming with bow-legged women." Just now,
interesting.
Which I think was my sign off, like on our very first podcast.
Yep.
I don't know why my brain just went there,
but here's to them as well.
Sure. Why not?